Lieutenant Preston Price watched his friend pull off a combat boot in a frozen Belgian foxhole in December 1944, and the sock came away with several of his toes still in it. No gunfire had touched him, no shrapnel. His unit hadn't even reached the worst fighting of the Bulge yet, but 2 weeks of standing in cold water had already cost his company more men than the Germans had. The deadliest thing many American soldiers faced that winter wasn't a weapon. It rotted their feet before a single shot was fired. By the time the army caught on, this thing had sidelined more infantrymen than entire divisions lost in actual combat that season. And it had a name from an earlier war. Doctors called it trench foot. It had already tried to teach the world this exact lesson once. Nobody remembered. Go back to 1812 first, because that's where a French army surgeon named Dominique Jean Lahaye first wrote the thing down. He was watching Napoleon's army disintegrate on the retreat from Russia, and he noticed something odd about the men's feet. They weren't freezing solid the way frostbite victims did. They were rotting, wet, swelling, turning colors that skin shouldn't turn, from nothing more than standing too long in cold, soaked boots. Larry filed his notes and the war moved on. Nobody followed up. For 100 years, nobody connected his observation to anything useful at all. Then came 1914, and the trenches of the First World War handed doctors the same injury on an industrial scale. Men stood for days in flooded dugouts, unable to move, unable to dry out, and their feet began to fail them in exactly the way Larry had described. By the winter of 1914 to 1915 alone, more than 20,000 British troops needed treatment, 20,000 men, from wet socks. By the end of the war, the British count had climbed past 75,000 cases, and the Americans, who arrived late and fought less time in static trenches, still logged around 2,000. Military commanders, for reasons that sound almost cruel now, treated it first as a discipline problem instead of a medical one. Company commanders were held personally responsible if their men came down with it, and a few officers were even court-martialed over their unit's numbers, as if willpower alone could keep a man's feet dry in a flooded trench. A medical officer with the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, Captain J.C. Dunn, pushed back hard against that discipline-first approach. He argued that no amount of attentiveness could keep a man's feet dry when the trench itself sat half full of water, and that punishing officers for their unit's case numbers ignored the physical reality of the ground they were fighting on. He was right. Eventually, the army agreed. What eventually worked wasn't punishment, though. It was a buddy system, and it changed everything. Soldiers were paired off and made responsible for checking each other's feet every single day, removing boots, drying skin, changing socks, no exceptions. Officers began checking their men's feet every single morning as a matter of routine, the same way they checked rifles for rust. Units that kept up the habit consistently posted case numbers well below the formations fighting in identical mud a few hundred yards down the line. Proof that the difference wasn't luck, it was discipline. Combined with better drainage and whale oil grease rubbed into the leather, the rate collapsed by 1917. Crisis solved. The lesson landed. Foot inspections became standard practice. And then the guns went quiet. The trenches filled back in, and an entire, hard-won piece of medical knowledge got filed away as a relic of a war nobody expected to fight again. Then it happened again. That's the setup for what happened next, because nobody expected static trench warfare in the Second World War either. This was supposed to be the war of movement, tanks, blitzkrieg, mobile fronts sweeping across Europe. Military planners built their supply chains and their doctrine around speed, not around men standing still in mud for weeks. So when the Allied advance stalled in the autumn of 1944, first in the Hurtgen Forest, then across the whole line as the front froze into place for the winter, The US Army walked straight into the exact same trap that had chewed through British ranks 30 years earlier. Except this time, almost nobody in command remembered the fix. The numbers built fast once the cold set in. By December 12, 1944, roughly 17,500 American soldiers had already come down with trench foot, and that figure kept climbing through the month. Stateside newspapers picked up on it that same December, and one report described trench foot as being just as effective as bullets at knocking a man out of the fight, which, by the numbers coming out of the ETO, wasn't an exaggeration. Almost 18,000 cases had already been confirmed by the time that story ran, and the figure was still rising. For an army that measured its strength in rifles on the line, an 18,000-man dent from something other than combat was the kind of number that got a general's attention fast. Historians studying the record later put the combined losses for November and December at somewhere near 23,000 men, almost all of them combat infantrymen, the exact soldiers the front line couldn't afford to lose. One armoured division alone, the 4th Armoured, logged 634 confirmed trenchfoot cases and another 287 of frostbite by the time winter broke, a total that worked out to over 8% of the entire division's manpower gone to cold injury rather than enemy fire. Medical officers at the time suspected the true number ran even higher. Men hid symptoms. Nobody wanted to leave their buddies short-handed on the line. Some historians studying the underreporting later put the real total for that one division closer to 1,300 men, more than an entire infantry battalion's worth of soldiers, lost to weather rather than combat. For a division built around speed and armour, that kind of loss was almost impossible to plan around. Tank crews could at least stay off the ground for stretches. It was the armoured infantry riding alongside them, dismounting into the same mud and snow every time the column stopped, who absorbed the worst of it, which meant the very soldiers a fast-moving offensive depended on most were exactly the ones getting quietly erased from the roster. So what was actually happening inside a soldier's boot to cause this much damage? It comes down to 3 conditions stacking on top of each other, and any one of them alone usually isn't enough. Cold, but not cold enough to freeze the tissue outright. That's the freezing injury. Frostbite, a different animal entirely. Wet, from rain, snowmelt, or simply sweat trapped inside a boot that never came off. And stillness, hour after hour crouched in a foxhole with legs bent and boots on. Blood pooling instead of circulating, the way it does when a man is up and walking. Doctors at the time called the underlying mechanism a kind of self-inflicted strangulation. The body, sensing dangerous cold, narrows the blood vessels in the extremities on purpose, protecting the vital organs in the torso by sacrificing circulation to the hands and feet first. That response makes sense for a few minutes in a cold wind. It becomes a slow disaster after 12 or 24 hours crouched, motionless in a flooded hole. The tissue starved of blood doesn't just go numb, it begins to die, slowly, and there's no way to reverse the damage once it's gone far enough. Rewarming brings its own agony, a burning pain some soldiers described as worse than the numbness that came before it. Left untreated long enough, gangrene sets in, and the only remaining option is amputation. The progression usually followed a pattern medics learned to recognize fast. First came tingling, or a strange itch that wouldn't go away, no matter how a man moved his toes. Next, the skin went numb, then swollen, tight enough inside a wet boot that some soldiers couldn't get their footwear back on once they'd removed it. The color changed next, a pale waxy tone, or a deep blue that meant blood simply wasn't reaching the tissue anymore. In the worst cases, the skin started to break down and the flesh began to smell. A smell medics in both wars described the same way, a smell of decay setting in on a man who was still very much alive. Catch it at tingling and a soldier could recover fully in days. Catch it at the blue, breaking down stage and he might lose the foot. Bruce Glover, a private first class with the 393rd Infantry stationed near Elsenborn, Belgium, lived through exactly that sequence. He spent weeks in cold, wet foxholes before medics finally caught it during a routine inspection. He later said he didn't want to take his boots off when they asked, because some part of him already suspected what would happen. He was right. He never got them back on. He was evacuated to a field hospital, then moved through Liège, then Paris, then finally to England, where he stayed hospitalized until May of 1945, months after the war in Europe had already ended for the men still standing. In the same admission group that took him in, 18 out of 35 soldiers carried the identical diagnosis. This wasn't one unlucky man's story. It was a pattern repeating itself across an entire theatre of war. For men like Glover, the injury didn't end when the swelling went down. Veterans who kept both feet came home carrying a version of the war that never showed up in a parade. An ache that flared every winter for the rest of their lives. A cold sensitivity so sharp that some couldn't stand to walk barefoot on tile decades later. The Army's own post-war studies tracked this long tail closely because it mattered for pension claims and disability ratings. And the conclusion was consistent. A bad enough case of trench foot didn't heal the way a bullet wound healed. It left a permanent signature in the nerves and blood vessels that stayed with a man long after Germany surrendered. By late November, the scale of the problem had reached General George Patton himself, and on the 21st, he sent a letter to his commanders that opened with a line blunt enough to stop a room. He wrote that the most serious menace confronting them wasn't the German army, which they had practically destroyed, but the weather, which, if they didn't act, might destroy them through trench foot instead. Coming from a man famous for talking about the enemy in front of him, that sentence was remarkable. Weather had become the bigger threat. What followed was a scramble to relearn lessons the army had already paid for once, in 1917. Commanders were ordered to make foot care a chain of command responsibility, rather than something left to individual soldiers. Control teams checked units for compliance. Men were told to carry a dry pair of socks at all times and change into them whenever possible, to dry their feet after crossing streams or standing in rain, and to remove their boots and massage circulation back into their feet whenever a lull in the fighting allowed it. Some veterans later called the orders unrealistic, given the conditions they were actually fighting in, and they weren't entirely wrong. But where units did manage to follow the program, especially once properly fitted rubber-soled shoe packs and extra socks reached the front, the new case numbers started to fall. The comparison across armies is where this gets strange. American troops in Italy during the winter of 1944 to 1945 suffered trench foot at more than 3 times the rate of the British troops fighting right alongside them. Same weather, same mud, same static lines. Reports from that period show the ratio of cold injury to actual combat wounds ran about 1 to 4 in the 5th US Army, compared to roughly 1 to 45 in the neighbouring British Corps. Some of that gap traced back to equipment. Only a small fraction of American trench foot patients examined that winter had actually been wearing the shoe packs designed to prevent the injury, and fewer still had them paired with the correct socks and insoles. And the Russians, who had faced brutal cold on the Eastern Front for years by that point, had essentially solved the problem already. Same fix as before. The exact same buddy system the British stumbled into during the First War. Soldiers paired off and made responsible for checking each other's feet, with real consequences for the man whose partner turned up sick. The German side of this comparison stays murkier, and it's worth being honest about that here. Captured German casualties examined during the same period showed cases of trench foot too, so the German army wasn't immune to it by any means. Some American veterans who served through that winter later recalled hearing that German soldiers were issued a foot ointment meant to guard against both wet and cold, and that their rate of the condition seemed lower, though the full picture of exactly how widespread it was in German ranks has never been as thoroughly documented as the American and British records. What is documented is that German boots were often sized precisely to the foot, which left no room for the extra socks that helped some Allied soldiers. A small design choice that may have quietly cost them more cases than any battlefield decision that winter. Which raises the obvious question: if a solution already existed, tested and proven in a previous war, why did it have to be relearned from scratch under fire? Part of it was doctrine, built around the wrong assumptions. An army trained and equipped for a war of movement, getting caught by a static winter it never planned for. Part of it was institutional memory simply failing, the specific knowledge sitting in old medical reports nobody in the field had read or been trained on. And part of it, uncomfortably, was the same instinct that showed up in 1914. A lingering suspicion among some commanders that men reporting foot trouble were shirking rather than genuinely injured. A suspicion serious enough that for a long stretch of the war, soldiers hospitalized with trench foot weren't even eligible for the Purple Heart, unlike men wounded by frostbite or enemy fire. A soldier could lose toes to the exact same winter that took another man's leg to a landmine, and only one of them would come home with a medal recognizing what it cost him. Once the ETO prevention program was fully running in January of 1945, the case numbers dropped sharply and the worst of the epidemic was over. Control teams walking the line, checking sock changes, checking feet. It sounds trivial next to the Ardennes offensive raging around them that same month. It wasn't. Those small daily habits were the entire difference between a division that stayed combat effective and one that bled out its infantry without a single German round fired. Commanders who had dismissed foot care as fussy, busy work a few weeks earlier were now signing off on it personally, because they'd watched it cost them a battalion's worth of riflemen in a matter of weeks. But the toll it had already taken stayed with the men who survived it. Some who kept their feet intact never fully recovered feeling in them, and carried a permanent sensitivity to cold for the rest of their lives. Others lost toes, or more. The condition that first got written down by a surgeon watching Napoleon's retreat, then relearned in the mud of Flanders, then forgotten again in the years of peace between the wars, had proven for a second time that it could take down more fighting men than the enemy standing across the line. It's worth remembering how ordinary the cause actually was. Not a secret weapon, not a disease with no known cure, just cold water, standing still, and boots that stayed wet for too many hours in a row. The kind of conditions almost any infantryman anywhere might have found himself in without warning. That ordinariness is exactly what made it so dangerous. Nobody feared wet socks the way they feared an 88mm shell coming in, so nobody treated it with the same urgency until the hospitals were already full. There's something worth sitting with in that. An army can outproduce and outgun its opponent and still lose thousands of its best soldiers to something as simple as wet socks and standing still too long. The war planners spent years preparing for tanks, artillery, air power. Almost nobody planned for cold feet. By December of 1944, cold feet had taken more American infantrymen off the line than most single battles that winter. What does it say about how militaries prepare for war when the threat that keeps getting men across 130 years of conflict is one their own doctors had already diagnosed and solved, only to watch the lesson get buried and paid for all over again?